right, so welcome to those of you who have joined us so far this morning. Thank you so much for coming. Today we have a fantastic speaker with us, Jahan Marque, who is going to be speaking to us about the effects of legalization marijuana has had in the workplace. This will be in reference to a lot of questions that you guys had collected ahead of time with us, but also as he and I were just speaking. He is a speaker who is going to strongly encourage questions from our audience members. He loves when we have a more interactive type of discussion. So for those of you that are attending today, if you have questions, please feel free to raise your hand, ask your questions, shout them out, put them in the chat log, whatever you're comfortable with, because he would definitely love to hear additional questions in addition to what we already had sent him ahead of today's schedule. Dr. Marque has over 15 years of experience in research policy and operations, and he's among a select group of professionals globally that earned a PhD focused on the endocannabinoid system with research on the structure and function of cannabinoid receptors and the molecular pharmacology of the endocannabinoid system. He has also been an advocate focused on consumer safety, and his efforts include the development of international certification and training programs along with co-authoring the American Herbal Pharmacopoeia's Cannabis Monograph. So with us today, we absolutely have a expert. And with that, sir, I will turn it over to you here in 1 second. One other thing for those of you that have not attended recently, we are accredited today for a CLE continuing legal education credit in the state of Ohio. If you are an attorney licensed to practice in the state of Ohio and would like credit for today's class, you will be asked twice to 3 times during today's lecture via the chat log to enter your name and attorney registration number. Please make sure that you enter your name as you want it on your certificate, along with your CLE attorney registration number for our records for the Supreme Court. If you are instead an HR member that potentially would like something like SHRM credits, we are not currently accredited for that. However, we can produce a certificate for you if you also respond with your name and the letters SHRM at the time we ask for attorney registration numbers. You would then be able to apply yourself, if you so desire, to attempt to receive those credits via that certificate. And do we have any questions before we'll turn it over to Dr. Marque?
Hello, thank you so much for joining today. Yeah, as was said, I have a long and diverse background in cannabis and cannabinoids. I've worked on a couple of court cases as an expert witness on everything from product label claims to genetic differences in cannabis plants, as well as a few employment cases and issues related to impairment. And the cannabis space is a really interesting space. All the rules apply and none of the rules apply at the same time. But it's really facing three, I think, kind of big issues right now. And I'm going to start off talking about some of those issues, but happy to take it anywhere you'd like. I assume that most of you perhaps have a basic understanding of what cannabis or hemp is, but again, I'm happy and have materials to dive into more basic details if you are seeking that understanding as well. But to just jump right in, the sort of main issues facing the cannabis industry right now, one is that consumers of these products, actually humans in general, we are very poor predictors of our own impairment level. As I say, reality is increasingly subjective. And I'm going to talk about some data from some studies that let cannabis users use whatever they wanted and predict how badly or well they might perform in things like driving simulators and sort of what those outcomes are. Um, the other thing is we see a lot of formulated products, and there are things that are said about those products like, oh, if you have this blend, you will not get impaired. When we're finding out that depending on how those products are consumed, whether it's taken under the tongue, inhaled, taken orally, some combinations, while say taken under the tongue, like an oral mucosal product, will not cause impairment. If that same product is swallowed or inhaled with the same ratio of compounds, it will cause impairment. And what I mean by that is we hear about CBD a lot, cannabidiol, this wondrous compound that's in an FDA-approved form known as Epidiolex, it can actually enhance the intoxicating properties of THC in certain circumstances. Other times, it can block them. So the mastering of these formulations, there's still a lot to be understood there. And the other thing is that consumers, some people might say they're gullible, other people might say that there is expectancy bias. And that is when people are told what to expect from a product, they may experience that, or if they have an association with a product. For example, we'll use alcohol, right? So some people are like, oh, I can't drink whiskey. It makes me agitated. But you can drink vodka. It's all alcohol. It's all the same active ingredient. Why would, because one has a different type of sugar or flavor, affect you so profoundly differently? So happy to, again, as we go along, answer any questions, take any side roads or tangents about this subject. But I'm just going to jump into a few slides, just kind of jumping into DUI and impairment testing. Get those up. And I really am happy to take any and all questions related to cannabis and hemp. If there are definitions of things I use and it starts to become alphabet soup, we can take a step back. But again, I'm going to assume that most of you have sort of a basic understanding of cannabis. And after going through this, I will go back and kind of talk about some basics when we talk about impairment and which compounds cause impairment. So if you're interested in some of that classical pharmacology, don't worry, I've got some of it on deck. So when we think about impairment in cannabis and people going out there driving or performing tasks, it is somewhat prevalent. Some of the research out there, particularly with driving, has become more and more available. And why driving studies have become more and more available is that for a long time, the driving simulators, I can pull up some pictures if you want to see them, but there are a variety of driving simulators, and they're located on universities. And some of these are giant spherical devices where you can actually put an actual car in and sort of drive it in place with, surround screens mimicking an environment that's real, yet in the safety of a warehouse with a car on a treadmill, sort of thing. However, because those are universities, they had zero tolerance policies on marijuana use. And so doing studies in the driving simulators on marijuana wasn't allowed, even with federal approval, because, again, it's a drug-free campus. You can't consume marijuana on university campuses, so you can't conduct studies on it either if the subjects have to consume it. So it's only till recently, actually, that some of these campuses have opened up to allow clinical studies to even take place on their campuses. And so, so most of what we have is from surveys. So more than 40% of marijuana users in Colorado and Washington have reported driving within an hour of consuming marijuana at some point in the previous year. 25% report driving a motor vehicle more than 5 times in the previous 30 days while using marijuana. And this study that's mentioned here, and again, happy to share any of these articles should you request them in the future. This article featured quotes and statements from people saying, I might drive high, even though I know I shouldn't. So some of the factors that go into making this a difficult issue is that there's a lack of standardized threshold for THC intoxication. There's no universally accepted threshold. People are just like, zero tolerance. If we can detect it, you must be impaired, which is akin to saying, hey, if we detect any drugs on the cash you have in your wallet, then you're trafficking drugs. So there are some just per se very subjective limits. And what is also complicates this is the long half-life of THC, the long amount of time that it spends in the body. And chronic users will have the same amount of THC as a naive user if the naive user has used within a few hours. Yet one will be impaired and one will not be impaired. So it is very, very difficult to determine the recency of cannabis use without kind of knowing if they are a a fairly regular user of the product. Um, there's also a polypharmacy issue. In grad school, we'd always say it's never one drug. So when someone shows up to the ER on a substance or has an adverse event, they're never just taking one drug. They're even if you want to boil it down to, they're using caffeine, they're using alcohol, they're using nicotine, they're using cannabinoids, they're taking all this stuff, um, and sort of which product is the perpetrator of the adverse event. It can be difficult to say. And we know that some of these substances are additive. Um, there's a lot of sayings about, should you drink, if you drink alcohol before cannabis, or you drink cannabis before, or you take cannabis before alcohol, like the effects can be subjectively different. What they say is weed before grass, you're on your rear end, right? So a lot of people have reported these interesting polypharmacy interactions. So driving study out of JAMA, here we see a bar graph, and in gray is the gray squares represent the composite driving score. So a higher score, worse driving. Oh, sorry, yeah. Beer before grass, you're on your rear end. That's the saying. Thank you. Weed and grass, same thing. That was the first CLE question to get credit, so thank you for asking. Um, glad you're paying attention. Uh, so when we look at the composite drive score, far left side, you see this pre-smoking square. That's their general score, their baseline measurement. And then they're using whatever product and their perceived impairment. And within 30 minutes of use, they are actually somewhat good at predicting how under the influence of the product they are. But as time goes on, particularly at this hour and a half window, there is a huge gap between I do not feel impaired, but the driving simulator has determined that that you're driving actually as poorly as you were when you thought you were impaired. But after about 3 hours, this again starts to drop off. So we can see that again within an hour and 30 minutes of use is probably when the greatest differences, the greatest risk is, not only in level of impairment, but also in just gauging your own impairment. So what is sort of the headline takeaway? Well, local man has no idea how high he is, insists he's totally fine to drive. So people may even say things like, I drive better like this. I feel fine. So again, there's a growing trend that if you don't feel impaired, then you're not impaired, and that may not quite be the case. And again, there's also an issue with people who uh, drive under the influence of cannabis regularly. They get better. You get best sort of what you practice most, and this has confounded some of the data. So some of the signs related to the effects of cannabis or THC on a person um, can be widespread. So when it comes to physiological, you can see things like elevated pulse rate, dilated pupils, um, lack of rebound dilation. So there is some tests that are done, like the horizontal stigmus gaze, with like a light where they shine across the eyes and you follow it. Um, there are physical things, the impaired performance, finger to nose test. Failing that actually is a great predictor of being basically impaired or intoxicated by cannabinoids. Um, More than three misses is a very good predictor according to some research. But again, there's a lot of things. However, also confounding this is that there are medical cannabis patients who use these products who may have things like tremors or multiple sclerosis is a common indication for which people use cannabis. So again, you have to take into account some of the context here. There's also some cognitive issues that people have seen in terms of uh, altered temporal or spatial perception. So, for example, the perception that time is passing faster than it is. So they did a open track driving, and they had Um, the people who had consumed cannabis would drive, and you have things like pop out at you at the street. You have lights you have to wait to respond to. And they found that one thing cannabis users or people under the influence of cannabis responded really fast to was a traffic light changing from red to green. And this was interesting, but if you think about it, this may be the one advantage. If you're focusing on a singular task with cannabis and you have this temporal like distortion that time is passing really fast, you might be like, that light should have changed. Why hasn't it changed? When is it going to change? Oh my God, this light is never going to change. So you're kind of like super focused on that because you think more time has passed than it is. So just to kind of give you a fun story about how that might impact things. There's also, in terms of neurological effects, increased oxygenated hemoglobin. And so they're actually developing some devices to test this. So there's been a lot of technology bursting in this area. But the big take-home message is blood levels do not correlate to impairment, as alluded to earlier. There's also some mood and behavioral effects, but these are very difficult to quantify and say a roadside sobriety stop or in the workplace. Um, so there's a lot of conventional techniques out there, urine, blood, other fluids, hair. Some of our data from highway traffic is not great because they took samples from cadavers and when they from roadside accidents and they found these huge levels of THC in their system when that was from the fat in their body containing THC breaking down and it elevates artificially the amount of THC in the body. And so that has led to some sort of not reproducible studies about blood levels and roadside accidents. Um, Again, with blood testing, there's no um, really correlation at all between blood levels and impairment levels, which is, again, very, very difficult. Hair testing is probably, it's worth saying because it always kind of comes up. It's probably the worst test there is out there. So if you have really fine hair, like straw-like hair, drugs will not stick to it. But if you have dark, coarse hair, and perhaps curly, lots of dark pigments in it, sort of like kind of like this hair. There's darker hair out there. Drugs will stick to it. So again, people could be exposed to the same amount of drugs in their environment, same amount of exposure, and one could pass and one could fail. And again, this has led to there being a racial bias into hair testing. And one of the issues related to that was a lawsuit with the Massachusetts Association of Minority Law Enforcement. And again, this test was discriminatory towards Black police officers because the hair texture literally makes them more susceptible to testing positive when they're really not. And so this case has moved through federal courts after over a decade, and it was resolved. And so Massachusetts Civil Service Commission determined that the hair test is unreliable and actually reinstated 6 police officers who were fired because of test results. Further, there's a Johnson & Johnson baby soap that some hospitals are using for a while that actually would create false positives when tested for THC, and there was a whole issue around that as well. So the methods are quite important when it comes to drug testing. There's a number of new devices in the works. This is an oral fluid testing kit. It's portable. It has a number of different types of advantages. It's point of collection. It's an immunoassay, sort of a strip. Is the drug present or not? So it really depends. You probably don't need to know exactly how it works, but that it is an antibody test. It does allow to look for the presence or threshold presence within the oral fluid, again, which can potentially be an indication of recent use. Pretty simple to use. And again, it cannot determine impairment. It can just determine the presence or absence within a threshold of the substance. So just a little bit about these oral fluid testing devices. They're really popular, but again, they do not predict impairment. They're non-invasive, they're easy to use, they're rapid results, but again, they don't replace laboratory instruments. They have a high potential for false positives, and there's really in total inability to determine impairment levels. But there are a dozen or so examples of these oral fluid testing devices available. There's breathalyzers. Sounds great. Who among us hasn't been tempted by some tricorder device to solve all of our problems? So there's been several startup companies that developed breathalyzers that do exactly as they say. They just tell you whether or not they can detect THC in oral fluid. They have different technologies, so you might get zapped with high field asymmetric waveform ion mobility spectrometry, or perhaps it's colorimetric detection methods. Again, these are all sort of at the advanced prototype stage, not really commercially available. So these, again, are receiving funding from state governments that have per se limits to just say, hey, we just need to find it. If we can't detect it, then it's a we're going to say that that is illegal or that leads to a DUI. I've actually been on the stand and arguing what the definition of zero is with attorneys, and people are sometimes surprised that zero is a concept. It's actually a human construct, um, and that we artificially determine what zero is. Um, 0 calories, you might actually have like 5 to 10 calories in that product. Zero sugar might, depending under what regulatory scheme, just no added sugar. So how we define zero is very important, because when we use machines, instruments, analyzers, whatever you want to call them, to detect things, it's actually a range. It's not a precise number. There's no ones and zeros out really in nature. Uh, it gives you a range, plus or minus within a certain percent. And the reason why you don't just want to have artificial sort of cutoffs is because if you're close to zero, you might have a range that's negative, right? Because again, every value in analytical chemistry, every value by these instruments is a range, right? It's not just a one, a two, a three. It's a two plus or minus two. It's a five plus or minus two. Just to give you some concepts and the reality of the instruments. And again, happy to dive into more details about that if you'd like. There are behavioral and physical assessments. The standardized field sobriety test generally works well for impairment of any type. It can assess alcohol, it can assess fatigue, and all things like that. It cannot, maybe perhaps not like detect cannabis impairment specifically on its own, but it has proved reliable in general. Because again, what is the goal, right? To prove the person is unsafe, impaired, intoxicated, or to prove that cannabis has been exposed to that person or they've been exposed to cannabis. So field sobriety tests can exhibit high false positive rates, even when administered by highly trained officers. Um, One study found that 49% of participants who received a placebo failed to adequately perform a field sobriety test. And studies have been conducted on cannabis exposure, um, you know, are struggling because some find mild to moderate or little to no sensitivity to THC in these field sobriety tests at times. But this is sometimes due to how much THC is being administered, the administration methods, the time after the administration, and even the characteristics of the participants can greatly influence it. But again, three or more misses with the nose touching uh, field sobriety test is actually a great predictor of impairment. Um, so here are just some cherry pick things from the literature where looking at this issue. So from this 2022 study, per se limits may not represent intoxication. Heavy users, daily cannabis smokers may still experience impairment for up to 3 weeks of sustained abstinence due to high base concentrations of THC. Um, so they talk about tolerance and frequent users. So, these things can stay around your system for a long time. Another study found that daily users, despite consuming more cannabis and reaching higher THC concentrations, reported similar subjective drug effects as occasional users, suggesting tolerance. Um, Again, different routes of administration, inhalation versus swallowing it, significantly affect absorption and duration of impairment as well. Um, Orally ingested cannabis may lead to longer impairment. So if you take a pill and you swallow it, you might actually be more impaired than someone who, took a puff on a joint or a vaporizer, but one would fail the oral fluid test and one would potentially not, even though the results would be opposite. So, um, another thing that's interesting is that oftentimes there's a big time lapse between when someone takes cannabis and when a blood sample is collected. And this has also contributed to inconsistencies in findings because it's probably during, the early part of that window when they consume products that, impairment is happening, not hours later. There are there are also drug evaluation and classification programs that officers go through. They're fairly rigorous, um, and they have these 2-year recertification. So it involves a number of different tests. They have to be sort of qualified to evaluate, looking at pupils, looking at rebound dilation, other psychophysical tasks, finger to nose tests, as well as balance tests as well. So there are some emerging technologies out there, um, including neuroimaging techniques. So this is still in its prototype phase, but it's very interesting. It can detect the subtle changes in brain function associated with THC impairment, measuring changes in blood oxygen levels. So you can see sort of the prototype on the upper right, this little backpack with a battery and a swim cap with all sorts of cool things coming out of the head. Oops. And then, it's kind of become more of a headband thing. And so what happens is light is emitted, light comes back, detector detects it. But one of the issues with it is that, well, first of all, it's easy to use. No sedation can be performed while the participant is moving around. Setup is really easy. But one of the things that has some challenges is that people make faces raising their eyebrows creates artifacts in the data. There can be interference from sunlight, so this might be a great test to use at night or indoors. And potentially cardiovascular and respiratory functions can affect those signals. So if someone's having a panic attack about being pulled over, that might also influence the situation, or any situation where people are anxious. So we're just going to attach a bunch of electrodes to your head. Please remain calm. One of probably the most well-studied is just the Druid app. This is an interesting app. It's more putting responsibility in the consumer, but it allows you to play these phone games in a sense. Games is sort of not accurate, but you use an accelerometer in the phone when you are not under the influence. And then when you are under the influence or have consumed something or are worried about your impairment, you can then do those activities on the phone, and it can let you know if you're still performing within your baseline levels. Um, so there are a lot of challenges with correlating THC levels with impairment. Um, there is not a straightforward relationship between THC and accumulation in any sort of fluids. THC is fat-like, one of the reasons it took so long to isolate THC and purify it wasn't until the late 60s that was really purified and isolated, is that it doesn't dissolve in water. See, all these other things like opioids and cocaine and all the things the Victorian chemists had a lot of fun purifying into crystalline substances was not possible with cannabinoids because they are fat-like sticky lipids that don't dissolve very well in water. And so when these are consumed, our body's like, great, this looks like fat. I'm going to store it with fat and store it in fat. And if you've ever tried to lose weight, you know how difficult it is to get rid of fat. Um, and so that stuff sticks around for a really, really long time. Chronic heavy cannabis users may exhibit higher tolerance and even perform better on driving tests despite having elevated THC levels. And again, this comes down to how THC is measured, because again, we're not looking at active THC. We're looking at something the body has processed and is excreting. And so when you're looking at that, and that's being slowly released from the fat, it could look like the person had just used it, or it could be, 2-week-old THC leaving the body. And there's a lot of debate surrounding the effectiveness of per se limits in accurately identifying any sort of acute intoxication. And this can be seen in policy where there's a lack of any universally accepted THC cutoff levels for driving impairment. Um, there are some caveats to this, of course. A study by Stacy Groover over at Harvard. It's a small school, holds a lot of promise to really get on the map someday. But following 3 months of treatment, medical marijuana patients actually demonstrated improved tax.
Dr. Marque,
Yeah.
I think we're having some difficulty. It had stopped. We couldn't hear you there for a second.
Oh, where did I stop?
At least for me, the last point I could hear was where you were talking about the caveat.
Oh, okay. So one of the caveats is with medical cannabis users or medical marijuana patients, sorry, and basically with medical marijuana use in patients who are using it, it can improve cognitive function. Um, and so as opposed to purely adult use or recreational users, um, which have seen a lot of decrements in test performance accompanied by altered brain activation in medical cannabis patients. Sometimes there are improvements, as demonstrated in this study. And there's been some theories about why this, actually, no, probably more like hypotheses, right? Theories are well tested and can lead to accurate predictions. But so there's been some hypotheses that um, maybe if you're in pain or you have spasticity and this helps relieve it, you can improve, your function generally improves. If you have muscle tremors and your muscle tremors decrease, any sort of neurophysiological task you sort of attempt to do will potentially be improved. But again, this is taking it a little bit better, saying that their brain activation patterns appeared more similar to those exhibited by healthy controls from previous studies. So depending on the context of the person, cannabinoids might normalize uh, what's going on in the body. There are lots of different legal frameworks. The main ones are zero tolerance laws. Um, for example, this is easy, strong messaging, again, but inability to differentiate between recent and past use. So whether it's a month ago or yesterday. South Dakota decided to put a cutoff of age as well. So the zero tolerance applies only to drivers under 21, for example. There are various blood or oral fluid concentration thresholds, regardless of whether you're actually impaired. And then there are effect-based laws, which are sort of based on observable criteria. There's a lot of subjectivity and potential bias. Some of the solutions that people are suggesting are combined approach. So if we have reason to believe that use was recent, they can combine that screen with perhaps a specimen collection or a field sobriety test. There are states right now establishing roadside oral fluid testing programs to determine whether um, drivers are impaired by any substance, not just cannabis. And again, some states have amended their laws to add the testing of saliva and oral fluids. And again, but most states, oral fluid testing is still voluntary. Um, Here is again just a table summarizing the methods and devices that are out there for detecting THC impairment. And you'll be quizzed on all of these, so memorize it. But again, this is just to give you actually just sort of a gee whiz. There's a lot of technology here. There's a lot of options here. They all have their strengths, they all have their weaknesses. Very few of them are reliable for predicting impairment. Um, so there, again, one of the things I mentioned earlier is the concern impairment or the cause of impairment. So that is something I think a lot of employers need to think about with regards to their policies. And so that there are different attitudes about this. I don't want to go into too much detail about that, but um, the main takeaway is that there's a lot of complexities to accurately detecting and assessing cannabis impairment. And I think promoting responsible cannabis use, encouraging alternatives to driving, and more public available education about the delayed onset effect of some cannabinoids, particularly with oral administration, which can lead to unexpected impairment. Let's see. So again, happy to share some of the studies that were mentioned here. This is my email. I'm also on social media if you find that easy to reach out. Um, if there are any questions, I'm happy to go into them. I'm happy to talk maybe a little bit about some other issues in the space because that is just sort of the impairment driving issue. And I know I went really fast. These are slides from the training I did for the Department of Alcohol and Tobacco Enforcement in Delaware because they were very much interested in similar questions that this group seemed to be interested in as well. Well, the show must go on. So I'm not sure if this group at the time remaining has questions or would like to hear about rescheduling, would like to hear about physiological effects, would like to talk about anything else that was discussed or go back to some of those slides.
I have a question.
Yes, please.
Delta 9, what is sold in really like mini marts and gas stations and golf courses. Can you explain the difference between that Delta 8 and Delta 9 and the THC that's sold in the medical and the recreational dispensaries?
Yes, we can talk a little bit about that. So, and did you ask about Delta 8 as well, or did you just say Delta 9?
Well, yeah, because I don't know the difference between 8 and 9.
Okay.
But anyway, the whatever is sold in non-dispensaries that has, I think, impairment effects. And I'm just curious what makes something rise to the level of having to go through the dispensaries versus can be sold in a mini mart or a gas station, or you see ads all over the place.
Absolutely. Yeah, let me pull up some information about that. Absolutely. That's great. Let me see what is the best thing to do because there has been a lot of updates around this. So let's start here. Oh yeah, you can't see my slide yet, but it's a great place to start. Trust me. All right. Um, so right now there is a bit of an issue going on, and it's a great topic that you brought up. So um, there are two things happening right now. One is that people are using these derived THC sold in gas stations and smoke shops and these sort of fake dispensaries that pop up, these wellness stores and whatnot. And that THC, Delta 9 THC, can be the same as the THC in cannabis or marijuana sold at a licensed state regulated dispensary. The difference is that they're taking hemp, mixing it with chemicals that you might find under your sink or order online, and converting compounds to versions of THC. So when Donald J. Trump signed and updated the Farm Bill during his first administration, he created the ability for this completely unregulated market, allowing liberties that no pharmaceutical company or cannabis dispensary is allowed, which is to just synthesize whatever you want from the hemp plant and sell it without age gating. It's kind of a very disturbing public health issue. And so you have these rogue chemists who are labeling the product sometimes as Delta 9 THC when it's a mixture of compounds. And one of the things that I've talked about when in actually on the stand under is talking about how small differences in these compounds can greatly affect the function of the compounds. And so what you're seeing here on the right is actually from a World Health Organization report that said you can take CBD from hemp and with very basic chemicals convert it to all these different isomers and versions of THC. And no one should do this. It's a really bad idea because it creates a lot of byproducts from the synthesis that we don't know what they do. We actually don't even know what a lot of these THC compounds do. So some chemists said, that's a really good idea. We're going to do that. And so you can go on LinkedIn and you can find chemists who shake around what crystalline vials, like vials filled with crystalline substances. I don't even know how to say it without it sounding bad. And say things like, yeah, hit me up at the conference. You can buy these from me. They make these compounds very simply. So here's an example. They have a catalytic hydrogenation. They hydrogenate these things. HHC THC, a version of Delta 9 THC, has recently been added to Schedule 2, I think by the UN. Their scheduling system is flipped. So the higher the number 1, 2 is less scary than 5. 5 would be like bad, where in the United States 5 is like basically you could have over the counter practically, where Schedule 1 is like the most restrictive category in the US, followed by Schedule 2 being the second most restrictive. In the United Nations, it's flipped, so it's always a little bit of a point. And so people will take things like starting compounds like citronellol, like that really smelly thing that's used to ward off insects, and olivatol, which is found in a lot of plants, mix it with all these wonderful things and create a bunch of isomers and antimeres, and then they just spray that onto hemp material. So there's a whole new classification system that's trying to come out to help people understand these compounds. So we have paleo and neo compounds. There's compounds our body and plants make. There are things that are being made in bioreactors. So you can engineer yeast to make the broad category, extremely broad category of what could be considered a cannabinoid. And then there's these what are called post-synthetic, composed, created, derived, semi-synthetic compounds that are being brought into existence right now. And so there's what's on the label of the product, which flip a coin might actually be Delta 9 at that gas station, or they're just bathtub ginning a concoction of derived drugs from hemp and spraying them on material. So it is kind of a frightening issue that people are dealing with. And they are marked as legal. But again, there's really no one regulating this. Once they get that 0.3% or less THC, testing on the product, out the door it goes, no other checks or balances right now. So what's even more surprising is that you can buy the BFG gummy, which has, I think, 25,000 milligrams of THC in it. But because it's really heavy and it's a gummy, it's a party gummy, it is classified as hemp. But you could never buy anything like that in a regulated cannabis dispensary. Um, so I definitely think that there are a lot of issues where people think the regulated cannabis industry is this big source of issues with people accessing the products. It's like, no, they have age gating. They are monitored 24/7 on camera. Every transaction is down to what plant was grown, to what was packaged, to what was sold, is all tracked and traced. Hemp industry is nothing like that. Like you can sell it to a 12-year-old walking in from school. And in fact, people have observed this where kids will walk into these gas stations and smoke shops and say, I need something to help me study. And they'll buy those hemp products. So again, there's no age gating, none at all. So there is a huge public health issue there. And let alone who can buy it, what's in it. And it's really a bizarre thing. So I participated in a research study actually in the state of Delaware where with confiscated police products, hemp products, and regulated products, we compared them for the same rubric of quality measurements, so potency, microbial residual solvents, pesticides, and other contaminants. And there were definitely loads more things found in the hemp products than have ever really been seen in regulated cannabis products. So lots of pesticides, lots of unidentified contaminants, lots of reactants left over from deriving compounds. I could go on and on about this interesting issue, but there are increasingly more case reports. I think I have some pictures of like the products here. So this is with, so you can see Girl Scout cookies, HHCP 9% premium. And so this is an example of some of these products that are being sold. It's basically flour like cannabis, as in the species material, sprayed with this stuff. They might claim it's natural, but it's really not. And I think that's the main kind of thing here to think about is that these cannabinoid products can be unpredictable. Let's see, what else can I tell you about that? Again, this field is really changing with the gas station cannabinoids. Who is testing? Who has access to testing materials? There are some field tests that police can do on the material, and by field tests, I'm not talking about impairment testing. I'm actually talking about analyzing the plant material that are in these shops, and so they do have there are mobile devices that can allow them to identify these synthetic, semi-synthetic, derived, artificially derived, whatever jargon the purveyors of this questionable material want to use. They have the ability to differentiate that. So again, just not widespread. The implementation is not widespread. But anyway, that was a great question that sent me down the cannabinoid rabbit hole. Happy to. I hope that gave you some information.
Yeah, I mean, it did. It's scary, but I can't believe that's not regulated more. But yes, that's scary to think about all of the chemicals and dangerous. I don't know. I can't believe that's just sold in drugs. I mean, you see it everywhere.
Right. And part of the issue is there could be a perfectly, you know, good company out there that's selling a CBD topical cream that is tested and meets standards, but it's sold right next to other products that are not. And consumers have perceptions that if it's on a shelf, well, by golly, it must be safe. If it's, look at a loaf of bread, look at milk, it's all on a shelf at a store, it must be safe. So there is a big public perception issue there. And then, the labeling issues are, they compound the issue as well. But,
And we
Great.
had a question in the chat. I'd like to hear about rescheduling.
All right. Let's jump into that. So so this is from a so there's a textbook that I'm an editor of and contribute to called Cannabis Innovations. So this is from that book chapter. So I'm definitely excited to talk just a few minutes about rescheduling. Um, so I like to think about rescheduling in thinking about what is the role of the organizations in defining what cannabis and hemp are, because that defines what they regulate. And so that is, I think, the main role that will happen through the rescheduling process, and perhaps the main role of the FDA is defining what are these products. So it's quite difficult to explain what the FDA's role is with regards to cannabis products and hemp products. Some people are surprised that there's been a cannabis products committee at the FDA since I think 2011, 2012. Um, Clearly, they've done a lot. Whatever it is, they don't share much of it. But again, I think that leads to some confusion over what exactly are they doing over there. Um, when we think about rescheduling, we have to remember the laws have changed a lot. So I'm going to just kind of point out some big ones, right? 1911, Massachusetts required prescriptions. 1931, Texas declared marijuana a narcotic, allowing life sentences. 73, you jump forward, Texas makes it a misdemeanor. Um, by the late 70s, you saw many states start to decriminalize it. 1996, a lot of medical use. 2001 through 2011, more medical use. And you really start to see adult use in Colorado and Washington in 2012, leading up to kind of around today, where you have a state regulators association that has 40 states that belong to it that have some sort of cannabis program. And California has introduced a bill to allow interstate commerce. So unlike what rescheduling could offer potentially is the ability for cannabis to go legally across state lines. So right now, the cannabis industry works like this. If you want orange juice, you have to grow the orange trees, process the oranges, package it, all in the same state. You can't have orange juice shipped from Florida, from the best places to grow oranges. If you want orange juice in Vermont, you gotta grow the citrus trees there. So it is a bit unlike any other industry. Hemp, just people ship it across state lines. There's no issue there. When it comes to rescheduling, the way this rescheduling process has moved has been infinitely better than anyone in the past. So let's just talk about 1994 here. The DEA denies a 72 rescheduling petition from 1972 in 1994. That was 22 years of reviewing the scientific research. There was not much available at the time, but it took them 22 years. Then another rescheduling petition was submitted in 1994. They denied that 7 years later. They're getting better. Then they took a step back because in 2011 they denied a 2002 rescheduling petition. However, as we see, and then in 2016 they denied a 2011 petition for rescheduling, and now it's been put on hold indefinitely for the hearing. Again, and what these were denying even just having a hearing about rescheduling. And so now advocates have made it to the hearing stage, and that's where it has stalled. But what sort of happened along the way is that there was a lot of weaponized political manipulation along the way. I'm not going to, a lot of people know about Nixon and his war on marijuana, but a lot of it is to do with regulatory challenges in this space. One thing I want to talk about is there's already a lot of products regulated by the FDA. regarding THC isomers and CBD. But again, we see cannabinoids across every category. So THC, depending on its form, is in Schedule 1, is in Schedule 2, is in Schedule 3, and is also not scheduled. So if it's in big bad marijuana, it's a Schedule 1. If it's in the form of Syndros, which is a liquid sesame oil suspension, it's a Schedule 2. If that sesame oil suspension is encapsulated, it becomes dronabinol, which is Marinol, a pill. It's a Schedule 3. If it's in hemp, c'est la vie. Another thing that makes this whole process difficult is the number of products. So this is a field. This is a very big field. It's a huge field of marijuana as far as the eye can see growing. Or is it hemp? We don't know. So, and this is a number. What is this number? This is a factorial equation, or the result of a factorial equation. We'll just, for fun, call this the Markov equation, named after its inventor. But basically, you take the number of possible formulations, so oral, inhaled, topical, whatever you want, the number of active ingredients, maybe it's 10 cannabinoids, maybe it's just 2, THC, CBD, whatever you want. Then you could have things like flavors. So if we just keep the flavors consistent. So basically, if you want to estimate the number of possible products that currently exist in the market, considering the variations such as formulations, cannabinoids, concentrations, and things like flavorings, when fewer factors are involved, for example, if we just use 5 cannabinoids, limit the concentration of those that are allowed to be used, we can get about 50,000 products. With only 5 cannabinoids, THC, CBD, CBG, CBN, throw in another one, THCA, and 5 flavor profiles, you get 40,000 possible combinations. Now, if you start adding 10 cannabinoids with 3 different concentration ratios of those, you can get 300,000 different products. If you say 100 cannabinoids and 5 terpenes, that's 9.4 nonillion. That's a number with 30 zeros after possible products. Looking at this again, I think I looked at something like the 8 cannabinoids that are required to be tested for in the States, in different ratios with 5 flavorings, get about 1.5 million products. I think there's only like 30,000 or 40,000 total approved drugs or products that the FDA monitors. So the number of product variation, product types, without even THC as their main ingredient, or maybe as one small part of an ingredient, is extreme regulatory challenge. So we've already seen what happens when cannabis is kind of descheduled with hemp. And so that may not be kind of the best option, because again, who's going to regulate 1 million variations of these products? So there are a few regulatory paths forward. I know we're shoring up on time, so I'll just start speaking exponentially faster. But I'll keep talking till someone pulls out a vaudeville hook. So we have the path on the left, right? Maintaining existing regulatory structures. We can look at rescheduling between 3 and 5. So I'm not going to talk about rescheduling to 2. 2 is a disaster. It really wouldn't be much difference than Schedule 1. But to get cannabis out of Schedule 1 with LSD and get into Schedule 2 with things like cocaine and stuff like that. So a little bit better, but doesn't do anything for really anybody. Research, the industry, banking laws, nothing like that. 3 to 5 actually allows companies to use bank accounts to declare tax deductions and things like that. Descheduling would remove all cannabis products from anywhere, from any of that drug-controlled status. Scientifically, this is a great option. As you know, for science, this would be fantastic. It would free up so much for the ability to conduct research without having 2 hands tied behind your back. There's also been a proposal of creating an entirely new scheduling category, because everyone understands the scheduling system and how it works. that just creating one more category to put a cannabis product in would be really clear and easy to use. So some people will actually argue that the current federal regulatory system is working well. But again, there is an issue with the banking system. There is perpetuation of many injustices. Descheduling, while removing cannabis and all its derivatives, it might seem like it would remove federal oversight completely. The FDA would still actually regulate aspects of cannabis. And so we would still run into an issue where if people were coming from one state to another to buy a product they saw an advertisement for, that would trigger the FDA's jurisdiction. Scheduling between 3 and 5 reduces criminal liability, provides tax relief, and again, supports an industry pretty widely accepted by Americans. This would not make all cannabis products approved. They do not become prescription drugs. They're not FDA approved. This just moves the strictness of the laws that influence them, like mandatory minimums, prison sentences, and again, recognizes medical utility of these products, their benefit and risk profiles, and things like that. Schedule 6 is something else. The lobbyists and political affairs experts who are pushing this have worked in like gaming, casinos, and gambling, and want cannabis to kind of be in the same category as that. That is rescheduling kind of in a nutshell. I would just say that the most likely to see outcome will be rescheduling followed by a cross-agency and industry collaboration. Who's going to regulate 1 million products, 1 million different formulations, packaging? You can just, even if you don't have access to a dispensary, you can see the wide variety of products. The person who brought up the gas stations and health food stores, there are so many different products. Who's going to regulate and oversee that? It is quite a monumental task. And of course, I'll just plug my book because it's the end. Check it out on Amazon or order it at Barnes & Noble. Talk about all this stuff in there. Volume 2 is coming out this summer. So thank you.
Thank you, sir. That was a fantastic presentation. We really appreciated it. I hope everybody enjoyed it. You definitely had some interesting statistics. So thank you very much for presenting to us today. For those of you that attended today, we will have another meeting next month. Next month's will be in person, and it's going to be a discussion on artificial intelligence in the workplace. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Marcu, and thank you to all our participants. Thanks, everybody.